The warm Charleston evening wrapped the city in a gentle embrace, the air thick with the faint, sugary aroma of jasmine drifting from nearby gardens. Downtown streets buzzed softly with a distant car horn punctuating the night, the low hum of conversations spilling from open-air restaurants, and the occasional burst of laughter slicing through the stillness. Beneath the city's charming veneer, however, simmered a history of division, its echoes still threading through the cobblestone paths and shadowed corners. Judge Desmond Carter moved with purpose down one such path, his polished Italian leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the uneven stones. His navy blue suit hugged his frame impeccably, a reflection of his meticulous character, while the silver threading his temples crowned him with an aura of hard-earned wisdom. In one hand, he gripped a sleek leather briefcase, in the other, a stack of notes scribbled from a speech he'd just delivered on justice reform, a speech that had stirred the audience to thunderous applause, its weight still reverberating in his mind. Carter's thoughts churned as he approached the dimly lit parking lot. The applause lingered, mingling with the relentless burden of the reforms he'd spent decades championing. He was a man of quiet dignity, his broad shoulders squared against the world, his deep baritone voice a steady force in courtrooms and lecture halls alike. The parking lot stretched before him, a quiet expanse save for the faint tapping of his footsteps. Flickering streetlights cast pools of sallow yellow across rows of cars, their shadows stretching long and ghostly over the pavement. His sleek black Mercedes-Benz gleamed a few rows ahead, its polished surface catching the dim glow, a symbol of his perseverance, a reward for years of climbing through a system that hadn't always welcomed him. He allowed himself a fleeting moment of pride, a rare pause in his ceaseless march toward equity. But the tranquility splintered in an instant. A harsh flash of red and blue lights tore through the darkness, accompanied by the low, predatory growl of a patrol car's engine. Carter froze, his sharp instincts flaring. The vehicle rolled forward with deliberate menace, its headlights pinning him in a stark, unforgiving beam. It stopped abruptly, blocking his path to the Mercedes. Two officers emerged, their movements slow and calculated, exuding an authority laced with something something Carter recognized all too well. The taller one, Officer Murphy, adjusted his belt with a casual swagger, his hand hovering near his holster as if itching for an excuse. His partner, O'Connor, trailed a step behind, his smug grin gleaming under the streetlight, his eyes alight with a cruel, almost childlike amusement. "Evening, sir," Murphy drawled, his tone dripping with mock politeness as he stepped into Carter's path. A thin, curling smile twisted his lips, his presence an unspoken challenge. Carter straightened, his posture commanding, his deep voice slicing through the tension like a honed blade. "Is there a problem, officers?" His words carried no trace of fear, only a calm authority that dared them to test him. Inside, though, a flicker of weariness stirred. He'd faced this script before, the same tired lines delivered with different faces. Murphy tilted his head, his smirk stretching wider. "Nah, just routine," he said, his voice thick with insincerity. His gaze flicked to the Mercedes, lingering with exaggerated curiosity. "Nice ride. Don't see many folks like you driving these. Care to explain where you got it?" The words hung heavy, a quiet venom coiled within them. Carter's mind sharpened, catching the unspoken accusation, instant lithe familiar sting of prejudice cloaked in feigned innocence. He adjusted the strap of his briefcase, his dark eyes locking onto Murphy's with unwavering resolve. "I don't believe I need to explain myself for owning a vehicle, Officer Murphy," he replied evenly. "If there's an actual concern, I suggest you state it directly." O'Connor let out a short, barking laugh, the sound grating against the night. He leaned against the hood of Carter's Mercedes with deliberate insolence, his posture casual yet possessive, as if staking a claim. "Relax, man, we're just doing our job," he said, his tone soaked in mockery. "Mind showing us some ID, to clear up any misunderstandings?" His grin widened, daring Carter to flinch. Years of courtroom battles had forged Carter's composure into steel. He reached into his jacket with measured calm, retrieving his wallet and handing over his ID without a word. Murphy snatched it, his expression unchanged as he scanned the card. Then, with a theatrical flick of his wrist, he tossed it back, the gesture dripping with disdain. "Thanks," he said flatly, his smugness belying any respect for the credentials of the Honorable Desmond Carter, a judge on the South Carolina Supreme Court. The encounter was no accident, no mere protocol. It was a performance, a calculated dance meant to degrade, to provoke. Murphy began pacing, his hand trailing along the sleek curves of Carter's car, his muttered words to O'Connor too low to catch but brimming with derision. O'Connor stayed propped against the hood, his arms crossed, his grin unrelenting. Carter stood tall, his dignity a fortress they couldn't breach, but inside, a quiet rage simmered at these two men, but at the system that emboldened them, the machinery of power that turned justice into a weapon against the very people it should protect. The scene didn't go unnoticed. A young couple strolling by hesitated, their curiosity piqued, their whispers floating on the breeze. Across the street, two men paused mid-conversation, their phones rising to capture the unfolding drama. Carter's gaze flicked briefly to a young man live-streaming the encounter, his camera a silent witness to the officer's arrogance. The crowd grew, a murmur rippling through the onlookers, but Murphy and O'Connor remained oblivious, too engrossed in their petty game. Carter, however, saw the opening. His voice, steady yet edged with steel, cut through the air. "Officers," he said firmly, "I strongly suggest you verify my credentials properly and reconsider your actions. You are making a significant mistake." Murphy's smirk widened, his amusement unshaken. "Oh, is that right? And what mistake would that be?" He sneered, his sarcasm a taunt. Carter didn't waver, his gaze piercing through the officer's bravado. The tension thickened, the low hum of the parking lot now layered with the growing chatter of the crowd. O'Connor pushed off the car, his grin sharpening. "Harassment," he echoed mockingly. "We're just doing our job, old man. You sure you're not overreacting? Maybe you've got something to hide." Murphy chuckled in agreement, their shared amusement a deepening wound. But Carter stood resolute, his presence a quiet storm. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice resonating with unshakable authority, "this is profiling. Your actions are not only unprofessional but unlawful." The words landed like a gavel, a condemnation of their abuse of power. He thought of the countless others who'd faced the same indignity without his influence, without a voice with weight of their unseen struggles fueling his resolve. These officers didn't yet realize they weren't toying with just another man they could bully. They stood before a titan of justice, a man whose life's work was dismantling the very inequities they embodied. The bystanders' cameras rolled, their lenses capturing every smirk, every gesture. Across the street, the young couple clutched each other's hands, their faces a mix of shock and anger. The live streamer's voice trembled with quiet outrage as he narrated to his growing audience. This wasn't just Carter's fight, it was a spark, a flare igniting a reckoning with justice, power, and accountability. The officers' theatrics, their casual cruelty, were unraveling before a watching world. And Carter knew the consequences would ripple far beyond this parking lot. Justice, he'd learned long ago, wasn't a gift bestowed, it was a battle won through vigilance and courage. And tonight, under the flickering streetlights, that battle had begun anew. In the dimly lit parking lot, Judge Desmond Carter stood motionless, his silence a thunderous declaration of resistance that reverberated far beyond the concrete expanse around him. The air buzzed with the low hum of whispers from a swelling crowd, their curiosity piqued as they paused their evening routines to bear witness to an unfolding drama. Smartphone screens glowed like fireflies in the twilight, each one angled to immortalize the Saint-Wo-uniformed officers circling Carter. With an air of casual entitlement, oblivious to the growing scrutiny, Carter, a man of unshakable poise, held his ground like an oak rooted against a storm, his dignified presence a stark contrast to the rising unrest. Inside, his razor-sharp intellect churned, meticulously weighing every word he might utter, every subtle shift in his stance. This wasn't merely about him. It was a stand for every soul who had ever felt the sting of unjust treatment. A quiet battle cry against a system too often warped by those entrusted to uphold it. Officers Murphy and O'Connor, however, seemed to revel in the moment, their confidence swelling like a balloon on the verge of bursting. They paid no mind to the onlookers, their focus narrowed to the game of power they believed they controlled. Murphy's hand slid lazily across the polished hood of Carter's Mercedes, his fingers tracing the sleek curves with a deliberate nonchalance. "Nice ride," he muttered to O'Connor, his voice a conspiratorial whisper meant only for his partner's ears, though Carter's keen senses caught every syllable. The gesture wasn't about inspection, it was a display, a crude assertion of dominance staged as much for their own satisfaction as for the eyes watching from the sidelines. Carter's chest tightened with a flicker of indignation, but he swallowed it, channeling it into the steel of his resolve. "Gentlemen," Carter spoke again, his voice a steady blade slicing through the thickening murmur of the crowd. "I will ask once more, verify my identity, and allow me to proceed. Your actions here are not only unwarranted, but will carry repercussions you cannot yet fathom." His tone was firm, measured, carrying the weight of a man who understood justice not as an abstract ideal, but as a lived principle. The words hung in the air, a warning wrapped in calm authority, hinting at the storm that might follow if they pressed further. Murphy's response was a dark, guttural chuckle, his lips curling into a smirk that oozed contempt. "Consequences?" he echoed, leaning slightly toward Carter, his breath faintly sour with bravado. "What are you gonna do, huh? Send us a nasty note in the mail?" The mockery dripped from his voice, a taunt meant to belittle, to provoke. He stood there, chest puffed out, basking in the illusion of invincibility that his badge afforded him, blind to the shifting tide around them. O'Connor, standing a step behind, offered a faint nod of agreement, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of uneasy crack in the fouade. He wasn't yet ready to acknowledge. Before Carter could reply, a new voice pierced the tension like a shard of glass shattering on pavement. "Why are you harassing him?" The words rang out from the crowd's edge, sharp and unyielding. All heads swiveled to find the source, a young man, barely into his 20s, clad in a faded hoodie and jeans worn thin at the knees. He held his phone aloft, its camera a steady sentinel recording every detail, his face alight with a blend of fury and fearless resolve. His stance was defiant, shoulders squared against the weight of the risk he'd just taken, his dark eyes blazing with a courage that seemed to ignite the air around him. The crowd stirred, their murmurs swelling into a restless hum as he stepped closer, undeterred by the officer's glowering stares. "I'm good right here," he shot back when Murphy barked at him to step back, his voice steady despite the electric charge crackling between them. The whole internet's watching now. His livestream was already a wildfire. Comments flooding in with righteous outrage words like profiling and abuse peppered the screen. Hashtags igniting that would soon blaze across the nation. The digital chorus amplified the moment, 1,000 unseen voices bearing witness, adding a layer of pressure the officers hadn't bargained for. Carter turned his head ever so slightly, his gaze locking with the young man's for a fleeting, meaningful instant. In that glance, a silent bond formed an unspoken thank you for the bravery it took to stand up, a flicker of hope amid the hostility. Then, with a subtle shift, Carter refocused on the officers, his voice rising above the chaos like a judge's gavel striking order into a courtroom. "Gentlemen, I strongly urge you to confirm who I am. You're digging a hole you won't easily climb out of phone that will cost you both personally and professionally." Murphy laughed again, though the sound was thinner now, less sure, like a hollow echo of his earlier swagger. "Grave error, spare me," he sneered, rolling his eyes. "What are you gonna do, bore us to death with a lecture?" But beside him, O'Connor's mask was slipping. His eyes darted toward the crowd, where more phones had joined the vigil, their lenses trained on him like a jury of silent accusers. The murmurs were growing louder, a tide of discontent he couldn't tune out. "Murph," he muttered, his voice a low, anxious rasp, "maybe we should cut this short." Murphy's head snapped toward him, his glare sharp enough to slice through steel. "Relax," he hissed, his arrogance a stubborn flame refusing to gutter. "We've got this." The crowd, emboldened by the young man's defiance, found its voice, a woman near the front, her hair streaked with gray and her face etched with years of hard-earned wisdom, stepped forward. "Leave him alone," she cried, her words raw with indignation. Others joined her, their voices weaving into a chorus of protest. "We see you. This is wrong." A collective roar that shook the officer's crumbling confidence. Murphy's jaw tightened, his hand twitching near his holster, while O'Connor shifted his weight, his smug grin replaced by a nervous tick at the corner of his mouth. The weight of so many eyes, so much judgment, bore down on them, eroding the bravado they'd worn like armor. Carter seized the shift, his voice cutting through the clamor with the precision of a scalpel. "You're not merely trampling my rights," he said, his gaze locking onto theirs with unrelenting intensity. "You're fracturing the trust this community places in those who wear that uniform. And mark my words, you will answer for it." The words landed like a verdict, heavy with the promise of accountability, a reminder that power misused carries a prissy lesson in justice that stretched beyond this single night. O'Connor fidgeted, his bravado replaced by a sheen of sweat on his brow. "Murph, seriously," he whispered, his eyes flicking to the crowd again. "This is getting bad." But before Murphy could snap back, the sound of crisp, determined footsteps echoed across the asphalt. The crowd parted like a sea, revealing a woman in a pristine police captain's uniform, her stride radiating authority. Captain Laura Bennett, a figure known for her iron will and unyielding standards, surveyed the scene with a gaze that missed nothing. "What the hell is going on here, Murphy O'Connor?" she demanded, her voice a whip crack that froze the officers in their tracks. Carter, recognizing her rank, handed over his ID with a calm that belied the storm raging within him. Bennett's eyes scanned the card, and her expression darkened as the name sank in. Honorable Judge Desmond Carter, Supreme Court of South Carolina. Her jaw clenched, the gravity of their blunder crashing over her like a tidal wave. "Are you out of your damn minds?" she roared, her voice rising with incredulity. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" Murphy's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. His face drained of color, his earlier swagger dissolving into a stark, cold dread. O'Connor stood mute, his wide eyes reflecting the dawning horror of their mistake. "This man presides over cases of police misconduct," Bennett continued, her tone a molten mix of fury and disbelief. "Do you comprehend the hole you've just dug yourselves into?" The crowd erupted, a cacophony of gasps and murmurs rippling through the night as Bennett's words sank in. Phones remained raised, capturing the officers unraveling Murphy's panicked glance at O'Connor. O'Connor's stunned silence as the weight of their actions settled like a noose. Carter stood tall, his composure a beacon amid the chaos, though his mind raced with a tumult of emotions, anger at the abuse he'd endured, resolve to see it righted, and a weary recognition that this moment was a microcosm of a deeper rot. The officers, once so sure of their unchecked dominion, now faced a reckoning public, personal, and profound. Justice, Carter knew, wasn't just a concept, it was a force, and tonight, it had found its voice in the crowd, the captain, and the unyielding stand of one man against the misuse of power. The night pulsed with an electric tension, raw and unfiltered, as the flaws of a flawed system were peeled back, layer by layer, for all to witness. Beneath the cold, unforgiving glare of the parking lot lights, Captain Abigail Bennett stood like a storm about to break, her presence commanding the chaotic scene. Her voice sliced through the thick air, crisp and unyielding, as she fixed her steely gaze on the two officers before her. "Murphy, O'Connor," she barked, each syllable dripping with authority. "Step aside, now." The two men froze, their faces drained of color, caught in the harsh spotlight of their own unraveling. Officer Murphy, broad-shouldered and brash, parted his lips as if to argue, his jaw tightening with the defiance that had always fueled him. But Bennett's eye sharp as a blade and twice as cold locked onto his, and whatever words he'd mustered withered in his throat. Beside him, Officer O'Connor shifted uneasily, his hands twitching at his sides, the weight of their failed power play pressing down on his slumped shoulders. With a reluctant step, he retreated, his boots scuffing the asphalt, his posture rigid with the bitter realization that their authority had crumbled to dust. Bennett turned, her movements deliberate, and faced Judge Desmond Carter, a man whose quiet dignity seemed to anchor the chaos around him. "Judge Carter," she said, her voice softening just enough to reveal a flicker of shame beneath her resolve. "I owe you my deepest apologies for the shameful display. This is not how we operate, not in this department, not anywhere." Carter tilted his head ever so slightly, his dark eyes meeting hers without a hint of warmth. The lines etched into his face told stories of battles fought long before this night, and his steady baritone carried the weight of that history. "Apologies are noted, Captain," he replied, his tone even but edged with steel. "But let's not pretend this is some rare occurrence. You and I both know better." For a fleeting moment, something akin to regret shadowed Bennett's feature lips pressed into a thin line, her brow furrowing as if wrestling with the truth of his words. Then she straightened, her spine snapping back into its iron resolve. "You're right," she admitted, her voice firm with newfound determination. "And I give you my word, this will not go unaddressed." As she spoke, the crowd encircling them erupted into a roar of approval, their cheers reverberating off the concrete walls of the parking lot. Murphy and O'Connor, heads bowed under the captain's watchful eye, slunk back to their patrol car, the once confident swagger in their steps reduced to a defeated shuffle. For Carter, the victory tasted bittersweet, like ash on the tongue. Yes, the officer's retreat was a triumph of sorts, a crack in the armor of arrogance, but it was a fleeting one, overshadowed by the looming war against a system rotten at its core. His gaze drifted to a young man standing a few feet away, the one who'd thrust himself into the fray earlier, phone in hand, capturing every second of the confrontation. Their eyes locked, and Carter offered a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement heavy with gratitude. Stepping closer, he lowered his voice, the words meant only for the young man's ears. "Thank you," he said, his tone quiet but resonant. "What you did tonight, your courageite won't fade into the shadows." The young man, still clutching his phone as if it were a lifeline, shrugged, though a softness crept into his expression, easing the tension in his jaw. "It wasn't just for you, sir," he replied, his voice steady with conviction. "It was for all of us." Those words hit Carter like a thunderclap, reverberating through his chest. This wasn't merely his fight. His humiliation laid bare was a shared wound, a collective cry for something better. As the crowd's energy began to dissipate, the parking lot settling into an uneasy calm, the moment lived on beyond its borders. The young man's live stream had already clawed its way across the internet, its tendrils reaching tens of thousands of viewers, multiplying with every heartbeat, a digital wildfire no one could contain. By the time Carter crossed the threshold of his home that night, exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. The study, with its dark wood paneling and shelves lined with leather-bound books, felt both sanctuary and prison. He sank into his armchair, the polished leather groaning under his weight, and let his head tip back, eyes tracing the familiar cracks in the ceiling. His mind replayed the evening in vivid fragments: the officer's sneers, the crowd's fervor, the young man's defiance. This wasn't his first brush with the sting of profiling. The memory of countless indignities simmered beneath his calm exterior. But tonight was different. Tonight, the world had seen. The sharp trill of his phone shattered the silence, pulling him from his reverie. Captain Bennett's voice crackled through the line, professional yet tinged with a weariness that mirrored his own. "Judge Carter," she began, "I wanted you to know that Officers Murphy and O'Connor have been suspended, effective immediately. An internal investigation is underway." Carter exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the phone until his knuckles ached. "Suspension's a step," he said, his voice measured but firm. "But it's a drop in the bucket. The system that breeds this, it's the real culprit." Bennett didn't hesitate. "I agree," she replied, her tone resolute, "and I'm committed to pushing for real change here. I'd value your perspective, Judge, if you're willing to offer it." He paused, the weight of her request settling over him. "I'm willing," he said at last, "but it'll be a fight. The pushback will be fierce." Her response came without a hint of doubt. "Nothing worth doing comes easy." The call ended, leaving Carter alone with his thoughts once more. The faint hum of the city beyond his window a reminder of the storm still brewing. Morning broke with the incident splashed across every screen and headline. A tidal wave of ink and outrage. "Supreme Court judge targeted in racial profiling scandal," screamed one outlet. Just as system faces reckoning after viral confrontation, blared another. The video, now a cultural artifact viewed by millions, was dissected frame by frame in newsroom panels, in heated X threads, across kitchen tables. Public figures waded into the fray, some roaring with indignation, others scrambling to deflect the glaring spotlight on systemic rot. Carter, though bolstered by the swell of support, knew this was no fleeting hashtag moment. He reached out to advocacy groups, legal scholars, and community voices, forging a coalition with a singular mission: dismantle the machinery of bias in law enforcement, piece by rusted piece. Meanwhile, Murphy and O'Connor drowned under the weight of their own actions, suspended without pay. They became pariahs, their names synonymous with disgrace. Murphy, once a towering figure of bravado, crumbled into a husk of himself. His bitterness seeped out in clumsy local interviews, his voice thick with desperation. "People don't get it," he snapped, his eyes darting as if searching for an escape. "Being a cop means split-second calls. Sometimes it looks worse than it is." But the footage and blink, undeniable, drowned out his excuses, and the public's scorn only sharpened. O'Connor, quieter but no less culpable, vanished from sight, his silence a flimsy shield against the fury raining down. Carter seized the moment, stepping onto a televised stage to reframe the narrative. "This isn't about one ugly night," he said, his voice a calm fire, burning with purpose. "It's about a culture that lets these nights happen again and again, unchecked. Real change doesn't come from apologies or suspensions, it comes from accountability. From tearing down what's broken and building something just." His words rippled outward, igniting protests, swaying policymakers, and fueling the coalition's tireless work on training reforms, oversight boards, and laws to choke out abuses of power. Months later, the courtroom thrummed with anticipation, a crucible for a reckoning long overdue. Journalists jostled for space, activists clutched signs, and community members filled the benches, their eyes fixed on the two figures at the defense table, Murphy and O'Connor, now defendants in a civil rights suit that had gripped the nation. Presiding over it all was Judge Desmond Carter, his robe a mantle of authority he'd worn countless times, yet never with such gravity. The irony hung thick in the air months ago. These men had loomed over him in a dimly lit parking lot, their badges gleaming with misplaced power. Now, they stood small before him, their fates tethered to the law he wielded. As the prosecution unspooled the video that had set this fire ablaze, the room fell silent, the footage a stark mirror to a system's sins. Carter's face remained a mask of impartiality, his sharp eyes sweeping the Senivri fidget, every whisper catalogued in his mind. He'd always believed in the law's promise of fairness, even when it failed him. Today, that belief would be tested, not just for him, but for all those watching, waiting, hoping. This trial wasn't merely about two officers, it was about the cost of unchecked power, the demand for justice, and the fragile hope that from this ashes, something truer might rise. In the dimly lit courtroom, a hush fell over the swelling crowd as the grainy footage flickered across the screen. Each frame captured a moment that stung the conscience. A young man, cornered in a parking lot, his dignity stripped away by the mocking laughter of Officer Connor O'Keefe. Connor's voice, dripping with disdain, cut through the air like a blade, while his partner, Officer Daniel Murphy, stood by, his posture rigid with authority. The blatant profiling unfolded like a slow-motion tragedy, and as the video rolled on, gasps erupted from the onlookers, each breath a quiet protest against the injustice they were witnessing. For those in the room, every second of that recording was a mirror reflecting the deep, festering wounds of a system that too often turned a blind eye to its own flaws. At the prosecution's table sat Evelyn Marks, a woman whose sharp intellect and unwavering resolve made her a force to be reckoned with. Her dark eyes gleamed with purpose as she rose to address the court, her tailored suit a stark contrast to the chaos of the case she was unraveling. She spoke with a voice that was both steady and alive with passion, her words weaving a tapestry of truth that no one could ignore. "This isn't just one bad day, one isolated mistake," she declared, her tone cutting through the room's heavy silence. "This is a symptom of something much bigger, a culture that not only tolerates the abuse of power, but quietly nurtures it." She painted a vivid picture of Officers Murphy and O'Keefe not as guardians of peace, but as enforcers of a warped prejudice, their badges twisted into symbols of oppression rather than protection. For Evelyn, this trial was more than a legal battle. It was a chance to hold a fractured system accountable, to demand that justice rise above the wreckage of unchecked authority. The prosecution's case gained momentum with every witness who took the stand, but none carried the weight of Jamal Carter, the young man who had held his phone steady that day in the parking lot. Barely 20, with a lean frame and eyes that had seen too much, Jamal stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of the witness box. His voice, though soft at first, grew firm with the conviction of someone who had carried the burden of injustice for far too long. "I didn't just hit record for Judge Carter," he said, his gaze sweeping the courtroom, locking briefly with the judge's stoic face. "I did it for every kid who's ever been followed in a store. Every person who's been made to feel like they don't belong in their own skin. People need to see what happens when no one's watching or when they think no one is." His words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered, a testament to a life shaped by moments of quiet humiliation. For Jamal, that video wasn't just evidence, it was a cry for a world that might one day listen. When the defense took their turn, the air shifted. Their arguments felt flimsy, like a house of cards trembling in the wind. The defense attorney, a weary man with a practiced smile, tried to recast the officers as weary public servants caught in a moment of human error. "These are men who put their lives on the line every day," he urged, his voice smooth but unconvincing. "They stumbled under pressure, who among us hasn't?" But the courtroom wasn't swayed. Officer Murphy climbed into the witness box next, his broad shoulders slumped, a shadow of the swagger he'd worn in that parking lot. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a hollow quietness that spoke more of defeat than remorse. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," he murmured, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "We were just doing what we were trained to do, following protocol." His words landed like damp paper, soggy with excuses, and the jury's stony faces betrayed their disbelief. Beside him, Officer Connor O'Keefe remained a silent enigma, his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly on the table. He'd chosen not to testify, and that choice cloaked him in a guilt that needed no word. His silence roared louder than any defense. Judge Desmond Carter presided over it all, his silver hair catching the light as he leaned forward in his chair. To the untrained eye, he was the picture of impartiality, calm, measured, his deep voice rolling through the courtroom like a steady tide. But beneath that polished exterior churned a storm of emotion. Desmond knew this case was bigger than the two men in the dock. He'd felt the sting of profiling himself decades ago. A young black man stopped for no reason other than the color of his skin, his dreams of justice born from that very humiliation. Now, as he listened to the testimony and watched the footage, he felt the weight of history pressing down on him. This trial wasn't just about Murphy and O'Keefe, it was about every officer who'd ever crossed a line, every department that had shielded them, every soul who'd suffered in silence. For Desmond, justice wasn't a gavel strike, it was a promise, one he intended to keep. As the trial drew to a close, Evelyn Marks stood once more, her presence commanding the room. Her closing argument was a masterpiece of emotion and logic, her voice rising and falling like a preacher at the pulpit. "This isn't about vengeance," she said, her eyes blazing with a fire that seemed to light the very air. "It's about accountability. Justice isn't a sword to wield against the weak, it's a shield to guard them. Today, we can show the world what that shield looks like when it's held high." Her words struck a chord, resonating with the onlookers who leaned forward in their seats. Hanging on her every syllable, the jury filed out to deliberate, and the courtroom buzzed with a tension so thick it felt alive. Hours crawled by, each tick of the clock a heartbeat in the silence, until at last they returned. "Guilty on all counts," the foreman announced, and the room exhaled as one. Cheers broke out, sharp and jubilant, though Desmond's gavel came down swiftly, restoring order. The verdict was a triumph, but he knew it was only a single step on a long, winding road. As Murphy and O'Keefe were led away, their faces pale and drawn, the reality of their fall sank in. Murphy's eyes flickered with something like regret, while Connor's remained fixed on the floor, as if he could will himself invisible. Desmond rose to address the court one last time, his voice steady but threaded with a quiet power. "Justice isn't about flexing power," he said, his gaze sweeping over the faces before him. Lawyers, jurors, spectators, all caught in the gravity of the moment. "It's about owning up to what we do. It's about making sure no one badge or not, title or not stands above the law. Let this day remind us that every choice carries a price, and the fight for what's right never sleeps. His words lingered, a solemn vow etched into the air. As the officers disappeared through the heavy doors, the trial's echoes rippled far beyond Charleston's borders, igniting a firestorm of reaction. Newsrooms buzzed with headlines calling it a landmark case, a beacon of hope for holding power to account. Activists hoisted Desmond's name like a banner, praising his steadfast fairness, while advocacy groups seized the moment to press for sweeping reforms. For Desmond, though, the victory tasted bittersweet. He sat in his chambers late that night, the glow of a desk lamp casting shadows across his lined face. He was proud of Evelyn's brilliance, proud of Jamal's courage, proud of the jury's resolve, but he knew the system that had bred this moment still stood, its roots deep and stubborn. One trial, no matter how seismic, couldn't uproot it alone. The war for true justice stretched out before him, vast and daunting, and he felt both the thrill of the fight and the ache of its cost. In the days that followed, Desmond's life became a whirlwind. His phone hummed with calls, reporters hungry for quotes, activists seeking guidance, scholars dissecting the case's implications. Invitations poured in, each one a plea for his voice at rallies, panels, summits. He took it all in stride, his focus unwavering, until he stepped onto the stage at the National Justice Reform Summit in Washington, D.C. The auditorium was a sea of FSS policymakers in crisp suits, community leaders with weary hope in their eyes, young activists clutching notebooks and dreams. As he approached the podium, a wave of applause crashed over him, warm and overwhelming. He paused, letting it wash through him, then began. "What brought us here was ugly and painful," he said, his voice soft but unyielding. "It showed us the cracks in our world. But tonight, I want to talk about what's next. Accountability is where we start, real justice is where we're going." He laid out a vision bold and clear, transparency in policing, training that valued de-escalation over force, oversight boards rich with voices from every corner of society. "Change isn't a moment," he said, his tone rising, fierce with belief. "It's a journey. It takes guts, it takes grit, and it takes every one of us refusing to look away." The crowd erupted again, their cheers a thunderclap of agreement, and as Desmond stepped back, he felt the stirrings of something unstoppable. Across the country, town halls sprang up, ordinary people finding their voices, their stories weaving into a chorus for reform. Resistance loomed, unions bristled, pundits sneered, but Desmond met it head-on. Pushback means we're hitting something real, he told a reporter, his eyes steady. "This isn't about tearing down, it's about building up. Justice doesn't bend to power, it answers to truth." And with that truth, he pressed on. A man shaped by the past, driven by the future, and anchored by the unshakable lesson that power, unchecked, would always face its reckoning. In a world where accountability had long been absent, trust withered, and without trust, the very notion of justice became a hollow echo. Desmond Carter, a man whose name would soon resonate far beyond the streets of Charleston, stood at the forefront of a burgeoning movement. His resolve had birthed a national task force on justice reform, a coalition of sharp-minded legal scholars, fiery community advocates, and weary citizens who had seen too much. Together, they plunged into the tangled roots of systemic bias, dissecting everything from the labyrinthine policies dictating police encounters to the half-hearted training officers received. What they uncovered was a festering wound, a culture of impunity so deeply entrenched that misconduct didn't just survive, it thrived unchecked and unchallenged. For Carter, these revelations weren't just data points, they were a clarion call, a foundation he wielded with precision as he faced lawmakers in polished halls and restless crowds in dusty town squares. One sweltering evening, the air thick with tension, Carter stood before a packed town hall. The wooden floor creaked under the weight of a skeptical audience, their faces a mix of curiosity and defiance. A burly man rose from his seat, arms folded tightly across his chest, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "All this chatter about reform," he sneered, his tone dripping with contempt. "But what about the good officers out there, huh? Aren't you just smearing them all with the same dirty brush?" The room held its breath. the question hovering like a storm cloud. Carter didn't flinch. He let the silence stretch, his dark eyes scanning the crowd before settling on the man. When he spoke, his voice was steady, deliberate, a quiet force that demanded attention. "I hear you," he said, each word measured. "And let me make this crystal clear. This isn't about tearing down officers. It's about lifting everyone to the same standard. Good officers ones deserve a system that mirrors their integrity, not one that shelters those who tarnish it. Reform isn't their enemy, it's their armor." The man hesitated, his hard edges softening as he sank back into his chair. A ripple of nods and whispers spread through the crowd, a fragile thread of understanding taking root. For Carter, it was a small victory, but one that underscored a profound truth. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about building something worthy of trust. As the movement gained traction, Carter found himself drawn back to Charleston's heart. The city buzzed with life, children laughing at street fairs, elders sharing stories on weathered porches, and young activists plotting change over steaming cups of coffee. He walked among them, his tall frame cutting through the throngs, his presence both commanding and comforting. At a community gathering beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak, a teenage girl approached him, her steps tentative but her gaze fierce. "Judge Carter," she began, her voice quivering with a mix of nerves and resolve, "because of you, I've made up my mind. I'm going to be a lawyer. I want to stand up for people, just like you do." For a fleeting moment, the weight of the world lifted from Carter's shoulders. His usually stern face cracked into a rare, genuine smile, the lines around his eyes deepening with warmth. "The fight for justice is a chorus," he told her, his tone soft but firm, "and it needs every voice it can get. I'd bet my last dollar you'll be one of the loudest." She beamed, her determination solidifying in that shared instant. For Carter, these encounters were lifelines, vivid reminders that this wasn't merely about laws or lectures, it was about people, about carving out a world where dignity wasn't a privilege but a birthright. Yet even as victories piled up, new laws debated in state capitals, oversight boards springing up like wildflowers, police training manuals torn apart and rewritten. Carter knew the road ahead was a marathon, not a sprint. Change, real change, would demand years, maybe lifetimes. There would be stumbles, bitter compromises, nights when doubt gnawed at his resolve. But he pressed on. In a dimly lit room, surrounded by his inner circle, trusted allies who'd become both confidants and sparring partners, laid bare his guiding star. "This isn't just about winning battles today," he said, his voice low but resonant, leaning forward so the flickering lamplight caught the intensity in his eyes. "We're laying bricks for tomorrow. If we do this right, our kids won't have to claw their way through the same mud we did." The words hung heavy, a promise and a challenge. What he'd sparked in Charleston had grown into a wildfire, sweeping across cities and towns, igniting debates in barbershops and boardrooms alike. Under his steady hand, it was no longer a whisper but a roar. But with progress came pushback. Late one night, Carter sat alone in his cluttered office, the glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows across stacks of reports. His fingers traced the edges of a letter from a grieving mother in Chicago, her handwriting jagged with pain. Her son, Goni, another casualty of a broken system. "Because of you," she'd written, "I dare to hope other mothers won't know this ache. Don't stop." The words seared into him, a bittersweet fuel. He tucked the letter into his briefcase, alongside dozens of others, each a testament to the stakes he carried. Sleep eluded him, his mind racing with the voices of the unheard. The next morning, bleary-eyed but unbowed, he faced another storm at a public forum. A police union rep, broad-shouldered and red-faced, gripped the microphone with white-knuckled fury. "Judge Carter," he barked, his words sharp with resentment, "we're out there putting our lives on the line every damn day. And now you want us jumping through hoops just to do our jobs. Don't we deserve a shred of trust?" The crowd stilled, a sea of eyes swiveling to Carter. He rose slowly, his suit rumpled from sleepless hours, and met the man's glare. "Trust isn't a gift," he replied, his voice even but piercing. "It's earned. Most of you earn it daily through grit, through honor. But when the system shields the few who don't, it betrays you just as much as it betrays the rest of us." This isn't about hoops, it's about fairness. It's about making sure trust isn't a one-way street. The room buzzed, some nodding, others scowling, but Carter stood firm. A lighthouse in the tempest. Within his coalition, too, tensions simmered. Evelyn Marks, a whip-smart prosecutor with a tongue as sharp as her mind, paced the room during a late-night strategy session. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, mirroring her impatience. "Desmond, we've got to go big," she insisted, slamming a fist on the table, the sound echoing off the bare walls. "Federal reform, national scope. If we keep nickel-and-diming with local fixes, we'll lose the wave we're riding." Across the table, a community organizer named Jamal, his voice softer but no less fierce, leaned in. "And what about the folks here, Evelyn? The ones who need something real, right now, not some grand plan that might never touch them." Carter listened, his brow furrowed, feeling the pull of both truths. "Evelyn, I feel the urgency," he said at last, his tone a bridge between them. "But Jamal's right, we can't abandon the ground game. The big wins matter, but so do the quiet ones. We'll push both hard." His knack for weaving unity from discord was his gift, a steady hand steering a ship through choppy waters. The toll, though, was undeniable. Friends saw the shadows under his eyes, the slump in his shoulders, after weeks of relentless travel and raw testimonies. "Take a break, Desmond," they'd urge, their voices laced with worry. He'd wave them off with a tired grin. "I'll rest when the work's done," he'd say, knowing full well it never would be. The movement had become his lifeblood, its pulse beating in time with his own. And through it all, he carried the lesson etched into his core: power unchecked was a poison, and justice set through justice was the antidote. Every step, every fight, was a brick in a foundation he hoped would stand long after he was gone. A legacy not of his name, but of a world made fairer by his hands. The air in the congressional hearing room felt thick with tension as Judge Desmond Carter settled into his seat, the polished wooden chair creaking slightly under his weight. Rows of lawmakers stretched out before him, their faces a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and guarded anticipation. Overhead, the hum of cameras buzzed faintly, broadcasting his every word to millions of households across the nation. His palms pressed against the cool surface of the table, grounding him as a wave of gravity washed over his shoulders. This wasn't just another day in court, or a routine speech. This was the culmination of years of relentless effort, a moment where he could speak directly to the soul of a country desperate for change. His heart thudded steadily in his chest, not from fear, but from the sheer magnitude of what lay ahead. He was here to plead for justice, not just to the panel in front of him, but to every citizen watching from their living rooms, diners, and bar stools. When he opened his mouth, his voice carried the quiet strength that had come to define him, a calm, unshakable authority honed over decades on the bench and in the streets. "Justice," he began, pausing to let the word settle into the room like a stone dropped into still water, "is the bedrock upon which democracy stands. But when that bedrock begins to fracture, when it splinters under the weight of neglect, an abuse, it threatens to bring the entire house down with it." His dark eyes swept across the panel, locking briefly with each lawmaker, searching for a flicker of understanding. "What we've seen unfold in our cities, in our neighborhoods, isn't a string of random tragedies. It's the inevitable outcome of a system left to rot for too long. But here's the truth I've learned: failure isn't the end. It's a call to action, a chance to tear down what's broken and build something stronger in its place." Carter's testimony unfolded like a map of hope and hard-earned wisdom. He laid out a vision for reform that was as meticulous as it was bold. Mandatory training for officers to defuse tense encounters before they spiraled into violence, independent oversight boards to hold departments accountable, and programs to weave trust back into the fabric of communities, long estranged from those meant to protect them. He didn't point fingers or hurl blame. Instead, he spoke with the measured conviction of a man who believed in the potential for redemption, not just for the system, but for everyone tangled up in it. "We can't demand trust from people we've failed," he said, his voice rising slightly, carrying the weight of a truth he'd seen etched in too many tear-streaked faces. "Trust isn't a gift, it's earned, and earning it starts with U.S. lawmakers, officers, citizens all stepping up to do the work. The time for half measures and excuses is over." As he spoke, the room seemed to shrink, the lawmakers leaning forward almost imperceptibly, the air crackling with the electricity of his words. For Carter, this was more than a policy debate, it was a reckoning. He could feel the echoes of every rally he'd marched in, every late-night strategy session, every grieving parent's hand he'd held. The hearing wasn't just his moment, it belonged to the countless voices that had lifted him here. When he finally stepped away from the microphone, a quiet pride swelled in his chest, mingling with a steely determination. The testimony had landed like a thunderclap, reverberating far beyond the marble walls of the Capitol. But as he left the room, the applause fading behind him, he knew this was only the first step on a long, treacherous road. The hearing ignited a firestorm of discussion across the country. Advocacy groups seized on Carter's words, weaving them into press releases and protest chants, urging lawmakers to rally behind sweeping reform bills. Social media buzzed with clips of his testimony, his measured tone cutting through the noise like a beacon. Public pressure swelled, a tidal wave of demands crashing against the shores of congressional offices. Yet Carter understood that momentum was a fickle thing, fragile as glass, easily shattered by apathy or opposition. Walking out into the crisp March air, he tilted his face toward the sky, letting the faint warmth of the sun steady his nerves. Failure here wouldn't just stall their progress. It risked deepening the chasm of distrust that already yawned between the system and the people it served. The stakes gnawed at him, a constant ache beneath his ribs. Leading the movement was like navigating a storm-tossed sea. Carter found himself pulled in a dozen directions, at once lobbying for legislation in Washington, soothing raw wounds in grieving communities, and tempering the public's soaring expectations. Each task piled onto the last, a mountain of responsibility that threatened to crush him. Yet he carried it with the same resolve that had guided him through decades of courtroom battles. Opposition loomed large and immediate. In the halls of Congress, the reform proposals hit a wall of resistance. Some lawmakers dug in their heels, painting Carter's ideas as a reckless assault on law enforcement. Political pundits fanned the flames, their voices dripping with accusation as they branded him a radical bent on chaos. One evening, under the harsh glare of television lights, Carter faced the onslaught head-on. The interviewer, a sharp-tongued commentator with a knack for provocation, leaned forward, eyes glinting. "Aren't you just weakening the very people who keep us safe?" he pressed. Carter didn't flinch. He straightened in his chair, his gaze steady as steel. "Let me set the record straight," he said, his voice low but unyielding, each word carved with precision. "This isn't about tearing down law enforcement. It's about building it up, making it stronger, more resilient. A system rooted in trust and accountability doesn't just protect communities. It empowers officers to do their jobs better. The real danger isn't changeites clinging to a broken status quo that's failing everyone." The clip raced across the internet like wildfire, earning him a chorus of praise for his clarity and a torrent of venom from those who saw reform as betrayal. The backlash wasn't just loud, it turned menacing. Anonymous letters arrived at his office, their jagged handwriting spitting threats. "Back off, or you'll regret it." A chill ran down his spine as he read them, but fear quickly hardened into defiance. If anything, the hostility fueled him, a reminder of how much was at stake. He couldn't will to let it derail him. Instead, he poured his energy into the people at the heart of the fight. He crisscrossed the country, his suitcase a permanent fixture at his side, meeting families whose lives had been upended by the very system he aimed to fix. In Minneapolis, he sat across from a couple in their 60s, their modest living room heavy with the scent of old wood and unspoken loss. A framed photo of their son, a bright-eyed young man gone too soon, rested in the mother's trembling hands. "We just want his death to matter," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry leaves underfoot. To know it wasn't all for nothing. Carter's throat tightened as he reached out, his hand closing gently over hers. Her skin felt fragile, worn thin by grief, yet her eyes burned with a quiet, unyielding strength. "It wasn't for nothing," he said softly, his words a vow. "I promise you, we're fighting for him, for all of them. We won't stop." The father, a weary man with gray stubble and calloused hands, nodded silently from the corner, his jaw tight with emotion. Moments like these carved themselves into Carter's soul. A gallery of faces and stories that kept him awake long after the hotel lights dimmed. They were his compass, guiding him through the exhaustion and the doubt. The toll of the work began to show. His broad shoulders sagged more than they used to, and shadows crept beneath his eyes. Evelyn Marks, his sharp-witted confidant and a pillar of the movement, noticed it first. Late one night, amid a clutter of coffee cups and crumpled papers, she fixed him with a stern look. "Desmond, you're running yourself into the ground," she said, her voice a blend of worry and exasperation. "You can't carry this whole thing alone. You're not invincible." Carter rubbed a hand across his face, the stubble rough against his palm. "Evelyn, I can't step back now," he murmured, his tone heavy with fatigue. "Too many people are counting on me," she softened, leaning closer. "And they always will be. But if you break, who's left to hold it together? You've got to trust us to share the load." Her words pierced through his stubborn resolve, and though it stung to admit, he knew she was right. Reluctantly, he began to lean on his team, loosening the iron grip he'd kept on every detail. The movement's defining moment arrived with the Justice Accountability Act, a bold, sprawling bill that promised real change. It called for de-escalation training, independent oversight, and community policing funds. A blueprint for a system that could heal rather than harm. Carter threw himself into the campaign, his voice ringing out in packed town halls and crackling through radio waves. In Atlanta, he stood before a sea of faces, the auditorium pulsing with restless energy. "This bill isn't flawless," he admitted, his hands raised as if to cradle their hopes. "No law ever is, but it's a beginning to step toward justice that doesn't just favor some, but lifts us all. We need your voices, your Ferretto, make it real." The crowd roared, their cheers a living thing that wrapped around him, buoying his spirit even as he braced for the battles ahead. Behind closed doors, Carter faced lawmakers one by one, his arguments sharpened by a lifetime of witnessing justice's failures and triumphs. In a dimly lit office, a senator with a furrowed brow and a skeptical frown leaned back in his chair. "This is too much." "Too fast," he grumbled. Carter met his gaze, unflinching. "Too fast," he countered, his voice steady but edged with urgency. "Tell that to the families burying their kids. I've seen profiling from both seditious, a black man stopped for no reason, and as a judge watching cases collapse under corruption. We've waited long enough." The senator shifted, discomfort flickering in his eyes, and Carter pressed on, knowing every conversation was a chance to tip the scales. Justice, he'd learned, wasn't a gift bestowed from on high. It was a garden cultivated through tireless, often brutal labor. And the consequences of power abused, they rippled outward, poisoning trust, shattering lives, leaving scars that span generations. Carter carried that lesson in his bones, a quiet fury that drove him forward even when the path grew steep. The fight was far from over, but as he stood at its helm, he felt the weight of history shifting just slightly toward something better. The air in the Senate chamber hung heavy with tension as the senator leaned forward, his brow furrowed in skepticism. His voice, laced with a trace of exasperation, cut through the murmurs of the room. "Are these reforms even necessary?" he demanded, his words sharp and deliberate. "Isn't this just some hasty, emotional overreaction to a handful of rare mishaps?" His question lingered, a challenge wrapped in doubt, as he fixed his gaze on Judge Desmond Carter, waiting for a rebuttal. Carter, seated across from him, didn't flinch. His posture remained steady, exuding a quiet strength that seemed to anchor the room. When he spoke, his voice was smooth yet piercing, carrying the weight of conviction tempered by patience. "With all due respect, Senator," he began, his eyes locking with the older man's, "these aren't just scattered incidents. They're cracks in a foundation, a system that's crumbling beneath the people it's meant to serve. Every moment we hesitate, every day we push this off, we're gambling with lives. Real lives lost to a machine that's broken beyond isolated failures." His words weren't loud, but they landed like stones, rippling through the senator's defenses. For a moment, the senator said nothing, his lips pressed into a thin line, but his eyes softened, betraying a flicker of doubt or perhaps recognition. Carter's calm reasoning had slipped past his armor, planting a seed of unease he couldn't immediately dismiss. The battle for the Justice Accountability Act stretched on, a grueling marathon of late nights, heated debates, and fragile alliances. It was a war of wills fought in dimly lit meeting rooms and grand congressional halls, where every vote felt like a heartbeat in a fragile body. When the act finally passed both chambers, the victory reverberated like a thunderclap. Across the country, communities erupted in celebration, streets filled with voices that had long been ignored, now shouting in triumph. For many, it was a turning point, a crack of light piercing through decades of darkness. But Carter, standing amid his weary coalition in a cluttered office that smelled of coffee and determination, refused to let the moment sweep them away. "This is a milestone," he said, his voice firm yet tinged with urgency. "But it's not the finish line. Reform isn't a box we check and walk away from, it's a living process. We've kicked the door open, but keeping it that way, that's the real fight." His team nodded, their faces a mix of exhaustion and resolve, knowing the road ahead loomed longer than the one they'd just traveled. The passage of the Justice Accountability Act crowned Judge Desmond Carter as a reluctant hero, a man who'd never sought the spotlight but couldn't escape its glare. Yet as the cheers faded and the confetti settled, the enormity of the task ahead settled over him like a storm cloud. Implementing these reforms nationwide was a beast of its own, tangled in red tape, snarled by political pushback, and shadowed by the constant risk of unraveling. Carter felt the weight of it in his bones, a quiet ache that gnawed at him during sleepless nights. Sustaining this movement demanded more than passion, it required a relentless vigilance, a web of cooperation, and a refusal to bend under pressure. Justice, he knew, wasn't a gift bestowed. It was a garden cultivated through sweat and sacrifice. Resistance reared its head almost before the ink dried. In some corners, police departments welcomed the changes, their leaders nodding in quiet agreement as they saw the promise of a stronger system. But others dug in their heels. Officers in defiant jurisdictions spilled into the streets, their protests loud and bristling with anger. They waved signs and chanted slogans, framing the reforms as a slap in the face, a declaration that their years of service meant nothing. In statehouses, emboldened by the clamor of their constituents, lawmakers drafted bills to chip away at the federal mandate, their pens scratching out loopholes in the name of local control. Carter watched it unfold from his office, the news flickering across his screen. But his resolve didn't waver. He understood the stakes. At a press conference, the room buzzing with restless reporters, he stepped to the podium with that same unshakable calm. "These reforms aren't about pointing fingers," he said, his voice steady as granite. "They're about forging trust. Change rattles people, it's human to push back. But we can't let fear or lies drown out the call for accountability. Progress isn't easy, but it's worth it. I know this country has the guts to see it through." The crowd split in response. Supporters cheered, their faith in him unshaken, while critics sharpened their knives, ready to tear into his every word. The national conversation grew louder, a cacophony of voices clashing over the reform's worth. Political pundits filled airwaves with hot takes, some praising Carter's vision, others painting him as a naive idealist meddling in a system he didn't understand. Through it all, Carter kept his focus razor-sharp. He crisscrossed the country, his suitcase a constant companion, meeting with anyone who'd listen, community organizers with fire in their eyes, police chiefs with furrowed brows, policymakers scribbling notes in sterile conference rooms. His presence carried a quiet authority, built not on bluster, but on a reputation for fairness that preceded him like a shadow. In one meeting, the air thick with tension, he faced a group of police chiefs who sat with arms crossed, their skepticism palpable. "I get it," he said, leaning forward slightly, his tone warm but unyielding. "Change can feel like a punch to the gut, like we're saying your work doesn't matter. But that's not it. These reforms are here to back you up, to make sure the system you serve doesn't let you down. Accountability isn't the enemy of good policing, it's the bedrock that holds it up." Silence fell, heavy and thoughtful. The chiefs exchanged glances, some nodding faintly, others still stony-faced. Not everyone walked away convinced, but Carter's words lingered, a whisper of truth they couldn't entirely shake. Beyond the boardrooms, Carter sought out the heartbeat of the movement, communities scarred by decades of broken trust. In a Baltimore neighborhood where the air smelled of asphalt and resilience, he stood on a cracked sidewalk, listening as residents poured out their stories. Their voices trembled with pain, anger, and a fragile thread of hope. A local activist, her eyes sharp with both gratitude and wariness, stepped forward. "Judge Carter," she said, her tone a mix of defiance and plea, "we're thankful for what you've done. But we've seen promises before words on paper that never touch our streets. How do we know this time's different?" Carter met her gaze, his expression softening with understanding. "You're right to ask," he said, his voice low and earnest. "Laws don't mean a damn thing if they don't reach you. That's why we need people like your voice. Your fight'll make sure this isn't just ink and air. Hold us to it." She studied him for a moment, then offered a small, tentative smile. A crack in her armor. "We will, Judge," she replied, and he knew she meant it. As the reforms took root, glimmers of their promise began to shine through the chaos. In one city, a community oversight board ordinary people with clipboards and courage unearthed a web of corruption, leading to the ousting of officers who'd abused their badges. In another, a tense standoff dissolved into peace, thanks to de-escalation training that turned instinct into patience. These victories sparked hope, proof that even a system carved in stone could shift. But the shadows remained. Reports of misconduct still trickled in, and public faith hung by a thread. Carter knew trust wasn't rebuilt overnight. It was a tapestry woven stitch by painstaking stitch, over years, maybe lifetimes. Still, he pressed on, driven by a belief that every step forward was a battle won, a lesson in justice worth teaching. Late at night, when the world quieted, Carter found solace in the letters that piled up on his desk. One, written in a shaky hand, stopped him cold. "Judge Carter," it began, "because of you, I got my life back. I was locked up for something I didn't do, and your work set me free. For the first time, I feel like the system sees me like I'm a person, not just a number. Thank you for fighting for people like me." The words blurred as tears welled in his eyes, a rare break in the stoic facade he wore like armor. In that moment, the exhaustion, the endless meetings, the venom of his critics, it all melted away. The fight was bigger than him, but it was made real in lives like this one. Carter's resolve rippled outward, touching new shores. Universities beckoned him to their stages, where wide-eyed students hung on his words about justice and grit. At one lecture, a young woman in the front row raised her hand. "What keeps you going?" she asked. "When everything's against you." He paused, his gaze drifting to some unseen horizon. "Change is a slog," he said finally, his voice soft but steady. "It's slow, it's messy, and it hurts like hell sometimes. But then I think of the people we've pulled out of the dark, families who've found peace, the streets that feel a little safer. That's the fuel. Progress isn't about getting it perfect, it's about showing up, day after day." The room buzzed with quiet awe, his answer a spark igniting their own dreams of a better world. As the years wore on, Carter's hair grayed, and his steps slowed, but his mission sharpened. The Justice Accountability Act had been a triumph, a testament to what courage and coalition could achieve. Yet he knew its lessons about justice, about the cost of power unchecked, were fragile, easily forgotten. The truest victory, he believed, lay not in the law itself but in the hands that would carry it forward. And so, with every speech, every handshake, every late-night letter, he sowed the seeds of a movement that could outlast him, a legacy built not on his name, but on the unyielding truth that power, when abused, demands a reckoning, and justice, when fought for, endures. The air across the nation buzzed with a quiet energy, a ripple of change that communities from coast to coast could feel settling into their bones. For Judge Desmond Carter, though, this was no time to rest on laurels. He stood at the edge of a movement he'd helped ignite, his brow furrowed with the weight of a single, relentless question. How do you make sure progress doesn't crumble like sandcastles against the tide of time? It wasn't enough to plant the seeds of reform. Knew they needed to be tended, guarded, and handed down to hands that would carry them forward. The real test, he thought, staring out at the gray dawn from his office window, was building something that could weather storms long after he was gone. Justice, he believed, wasn't a fleeting victory. It was a legacy forged through resilience, and he felt the urgency of that truth deep in his chest. Carter's mind churned with possibilities, his heart restless with purpose. He couldn't just rely on laws scratched onto paper. They'd fade under the shifting whims of politics. unless rooted in something stronger. That's when the idea struck him, sharp and clear as a bell tolling through fog. A foundation. Not just any organization, but a living, breathing force to cradle the ideals he'd fought for: accountability, fairness, the unyielding demand that every soul be seen and valued. He called it the Justice for All Foundation, a non-profit born from his vision of a world where power didn't trample the powerless. It would stand as a sentinel, watching over the systems that too often failed, while also stretching out its hands to lift up those who needed it, offering legal aid, funding training for advocates, and pushing for policies that didn't just patch holes, but rebuilt the whole damn house. The day of the Foundation's first meeting arrived, crisp and electric with possibility. Carter stepped into a room humming with voiceless activists with fire in their eyes, supporters clutching notebooks and dreams. The wood-paneled walls seemed to lean in as he took the podium, his presence steady and unassuming, yet carrying the quiet thunder of a man who'd walked through fire. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice low but piercing, cutting through the chatter like a blade through silk. "It's about you, all of us. It's about every voice that's cried out for justice, every life hanging in the balance. What we've started is just the first step. This foundation exists to make sure this fight doesn't die with use. It grows, that it endures, until every single person in this country can stand tall, treated with the dignity they're owed." His words hung in the air, heavy with promise, and the room erupted in applause, a wave of sound that felt like the heartbeat of the movement itself. To breathe life into this vision, Carter knew he couldn't do it alone. He gathered a team as varied as the nation itself, each member a thread in the tapestry he was weaving. Among them was Evelyn Marks, a woman whose mind was a steel trap, her legal prowess a cornerstone of the movement's early days. She sat across from Carter in a cluttered office one evening, papers strewn like fallen leaves, her sharp eyes glinting with resolve. "This work," she said, tapping a pen against her notepad, "it's not just about heart, it's about precision. You've got both, Desmond. That's why you're the one to lead this. We've clawed our way too far to let it slip now. Let's make it mean something." Her smile was a rare thing, bright and fierce, and Carter felt a swell of gratitude for her unshakable faith. Evelyn would steer the Foundation's policy arm, her hands steady as she sculpted reforms that reached further than anyone had dared hope. But Carter's vision stretched beyond the polished desks of lawmakers. He wanted the Foundation to amplify the voices, that power to often drown out hoes from the margins, the ones who'd borne the brunt of a broken system. He pictured young leaders rising up, their stories fueling the fight. And so the fellowship program was born. It offered mentorship, money, and a megaphone to those who'd dedicate their lives to equity and accountability. Carter saw it as a garden, each fellow a seedling that, with care, would grow into a mighty oak. He'd sit in on their sessions sometimes, listening as they shared their dreams, their fears, their fury, and he'd feel a quiet pride, knowing the torch was already passing into hands that wouldn't let it flicker out. As the Foundation took root, Carter's thoughts often drifted back to where it all began. He could still see that parking lot, the sodium glow of streetlights flickering like dying stars, the smug curl of Officer Murphy's lip as he loomed over him. Connor, a weary kid with a phone trembling in his hands, had captured it all. Confrontation that turned Carter's simmering frustration into a roar. That night had been a furnace, searing away his hesitation and forging him into something new. But it wasn't just his story that kept him going. It was the mother in Baltimore, her voice breaking as she begged for change after losing her son to a system that didn't care. It was the young man, eyes wide with disbelief, walking free thanks to the Justice Accountability Act. It was the students who'd crowded around him after his speech, their faces alight with possibility. Those memories were his fuel, a chorus of voices that echoed in his skull, urging him onward when exhaustion threatened to pull him under. The movement's reach soon spilled beyond America's borders, a tide that couldn't be contained. International leaders began dialing Carter's number, their voices crackling over the line as they sought his counsel on dismantling bias in their own lands. He welcomed it, his mind buzzing with the chance to trade lessons across oceans. At a global summit in The Hague, he stood beneath a vaulted ceiling, the weight of the world pressing down as he faced a sea of delegates. "Justice doesn't stop at a border," he declared, his gaze sweeping the room. Dignity, equality. The rule of law. These aren't American ideals, they're human ones. We draw strength from our own fights, yes, but we grow stronger still when we lean on each other. The words landed like stones in still water, rippling outward, and Carter felt the threads of a global tapestry tightening around him. His legacy wasn't just national anymore, it was a beacon for a world hungry for fairness. Time marched on, and Carter knew he couldn't cling to the reins forever. Stepping back from the Foundation's daily grind was like prying his fingers off a lifeline, a bittersweet ache settling into his bones. He'd poured his soul into this, but he understood that real leadership meant trusting others to carry the flame. In his last public speech as its active head, he stood before a crowd that stretched to the horizon, their faces a mosaic of hope and grit. "When this started, I couldn't have dreamed where it'd take us," he said, his voice thick with emotion, a rare crack in his steady facade. "What we've built together proves what happens when we say no to injustice and mean it. But this isn't the end, it's yours now. I know you'll take it further, with the same fire that's gotten us here." The applause roared like a storm, a tribute not just to him, but to the countless hands that had lifted this dream into reality. In the years that followed, Carter retreated to quieter corners of life. He penned a memoir, Scale of Justice, his pen scratching late into the night as he traced the journey from that parking lot to the sweeping reforms that followed. The book flew off shelves, its pages a mirror for readers to see their own power reflected back. He spent lazy afternoons with his grandchildren, their laughter a balm as he wove tales of the movement into their lives, hoping to plant the seeds of justice in their tender hearts. The Foundation thrived without him, a testament to the leaders he'd nurtured. Devlin with her relentless drive, the fellows who'd grown into forces of their own. Murphy, the officer from that fateful night, faded into obscurity, a footnote whose arrogance had unwittingly sparked a revolution. Connor, now a filmmaker, turned that grainy video into a documentary that shook consciences awake. Carter's work had rewritten the justice system in ways that echoed through generations, a blueprint for accountability that others studied and built upon. Yet his truest gift was the faith he'd sown that progress, though a slow and bruising climb, was a prize worth chasing. In the stillness of his later years, he'd sit on his porch, the world softening around him, and mull over a phrase he'd repeated like a prayer. "Justice isn't about perfection, it's about persistence." Those words had become a lighthouse, guiding the movement and the people that touched toward a horizon where fairness wasn't just a dream, but a hard-won truth. The lesson was clear: power, when abused, sows its own downfall, but justice, when nurtured, endures beyond any one soul's reach. The sun blazed high over downtown Chicago on a sweltering Monday morning, its relentless heat pressing down on the city like a heavy hand. Officer James Mitchell adjusted the collar of his crisp blue uniform, already damp with sweat, as he maneuvered his patrol car through the humming streets of the 47th Precinct. Having recently traded the quiet, tree-lined roads of a suburban beat for the chaotic pulse of the city, Mitchell felt a restless energy surging through him. 5 years on the force had honed his instincts, but this new assignment stirred a nervous excitement in his chest, as though he were a wide-eyed rookie stepping into the unknown. The towering office buildings and bustling crowds were a far cry from the sleepy, mostly white neighborhood he'd left behind, and he couldn't shake the unease that came with navigating this diverse, unpredictable territory. As he cruised down Michigan Avenue, the summer air thick and sticky against his skin, Mitchell's eyes caught a flash of movement, a sleek black BMW gliding through a turn. Without a proper signal, the car gleamed in the sunlight, its flawless paint job shimmering like a dark mirror, exuding an air of effortless luxury. Something about it pricked at Mitchell's nerves, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Maybe it was the contrast between the car's opulence and the gritty surroundings. Or maybe it was the old warnings from his suburban colleagues, echoing in his mindful remembered tales of city folk who thought they were above the law. Flicking on his patrol lights with a quick, decisive motion, he pulled up behind the BMW, watching as it eased to the curb with a smoothness that suggested the driver had done this dance before. Through the rearview mirror, Mitchell studied the man behind the wheel. He sat with an unshakable calm, his hands moving deliberately as he reached for what Mitchell assumed were his license and registration. Stepping out of his car, Mitchell approached the driver's window, the heat radiating off the asphalt in waves. Up close, the man was strikingly 50s, with a charcoal gray suit tailored so perfectly it seemed to mold to his frame. A gold tie pin glinted subtly in the sun, and his cufflinks hinted at quiet wealth. Yet, instead of easing Mitchell's suspicions, the man's polished appearance only deepened them, stirring an itch of resentment he didn't fully understand. "License and registration," Mitchell barked, his voice cutting through the air sharper than he'd intended. His hand hovered near his holster, a reflex born of habit rather than necessity. Though nothing about the man suggested danger, the driver met Mitchell's gaze with a steady, dignified composure that seemed almost rehearsed. "Of course, officer," he replied, his voice deep and resonant, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to command. He moved slowly, deliberately, retrieving his documents from the glove compartment with hands kept carefully in view. "I believe I know what this is about," he added, offering the papers with a practiced ease. "The turn signal at the last intersection. I apologize if it wasn't clear enough. He did try to signal, though perhaps not as early as I should have." Mitchell snatched the documents without a word, ignoring the man's polite explanation. The license identified him as Marcus Thompson, a resident of one of Chicago's wealthiest enclaves. The address alone might have impressed someone else, but to Mitchell, it only fueled a simmering irritation he couldn't name. Here was a man who exuded control, wealth, and confidence. Severing Mitchell felt slipping through his own fingers in this unfamiliar city. "You people think you can just drive around in fancy cars and ignore traffic laws," he muttered, the words spilling out before he could rein them in. They carried the bitter edge of prejudices he'd absorbed over years, biases he'd never bothered to question until they tumbled out into the open. Thompson's face remained a mask of neutrality, but his dark eyes flicked to Mitchell's in the side mirror, holding his stare with an intensity that made the officer's skin prickle. "Excuse me, officer," he said, his tone still measured but edged with quiet steel. "What do you mean by you people?" The question hung in the air, sharp and deliberate, daring Mitchell to backtrack. But instead of retreating, Mitchell leaned in, his voice rising with defiance. "Listen, I don't care what kind of car you drive or what fancy suit you're wearing. Rules are rules." His pen flew across his ticket pad as he scribbled not just one citation, but three. The turn signal, an exaggerated claim of excessive window tint, though the windows looked perfectly legal, and an obstructed license plate that was, in truth, fully visible in the morning light. Thompson watched in silence, his expression unreadable, though a faint tremor in his jaw hinted at something deeper, anger, perhaps, or resolve. "Officer Mitchell," he said, glancing at the name tag as Mitchell thrust the tickets through the window. His voice remained calm, but there was a new weight to it, a subtle shift that should have set off alarms in Mitchell's mind. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor about this interaction," Mitchell scoffed, his lips curling into a smirk. "File a complaint if you want. We both know how that'll go." Thompson took the tickets with care, folding them neatly and slipping them into his suit pocket. "Indeed we do, Officer Mitchell," he replied, his words laced with a quiet certainty. "Indeed we do." The BMW pulled away moments later, vanishing into the flow of traffic, while Mitchell strutted back to his patrol car, chest puffed with satisfaction. He'd shown this rich guy that money couldn't buy a free passnet on his watch. For the next 2 weeks, life rolled on as usual for Mitchell. He patrolled the sun-scorched streets, handed out tickets to flustered drivers, and began to find his rhythm in the 47th precinct. The encounter with the BMW faded into the background, just another fleeting moment in the grind of his days. He'd even bragged about it once or twice to his partner, Officer Sarah Rodriguez, a weary 10-year veteran with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense air. "Put some rich guy in his place," he'd said with a grin, expecting her to nod along. But Sarah's face had tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. She'd seen officers like Mitchell before, newcomers from the suburbs, who dragged their baggage into the city, their snap judgments clashing with the reality of the streets. Most of them either grew out of it or burned out fast. She kept her thoughts to herself, though, offering only a curt, "Yeah, sure," before changing the subject. Then came a Thursday afternoon thick with humidity. the precinct buzzing with the usual chaos of ringing phones and clattering keyboards. Mitchell was hunched over his desk, scribbling through a stack of paperwork, when the precinct secretary approached, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. She carried an envelope that looked too official for routine business, her expression pinched with a seriousness that made Mitchell's stomach twist. "Officer Mitchell," she said, holding it out. "This just came for you, from the district court." He tore it open with a cocky grin, expecting some minor nuisance, but the words inside hit him like a punch to the gut. A summons. He was ordered to appear in court the next morning at 9 a.m. sharp. Regarding the citations he'd issued to Marcus Thompson, his smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease he quickly buried. "Nah, just that BMW guy from a couple weeks back," he told Sarah when she asked, forcing a laugh. "Thinks his fancy lawyer can wiggle him out of it. I've got my notes right here solid as a rock." He patted his logbook with a bravado he didn't fully feel. That night, Mitchell lingered over his preparations, polishing his badge until it gleamed, pressing his uniform until every crease was razor sharp. He flipped through his logbook again and again, rehearsing his version of events in his mind. He'd been to traffic court plenty of times, never lost a case. This would be no different, his word against some entitled civilians whining. By the time he strode into the courthouse the next morning, his confidence was back in place, his boots echoing against the polished floor. But as he neared courtroom 3B, a strange scene stopped him cold. High-ranking brass milled about the hallway. Captain Wilson, his stern-faced supervisor, the precinct commander, a towering figure rarely seen outside his office, and others he couldn't place. "What's going on?" he whispered to Sarah, who'd tagged along to back him up, her brow furrowed, her voice low. "I don't know, but this doesn't feel right." Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. The gallery was packed for too many people for a simple traffic dispute. Mitchell spotted internal affairs officers among them, their faces carved from stone, watching him with unblinking focus. His pulse quickened, but he squared his shoulders, clinging to the belief that he could handle this. Captain Wilson approached him just before the gavel fell, his voice a low growl. "Mitchell, anything you want to tell me about this stop before we get started?" Confusion clouded Mitchell's mind. "Sir, it was routine. Guy didn't signal, gave me attitude. So I wrote him up. Nothing special." Wilson's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "We'll see about that," he muttered, turning away as Judge Eleanor Martinez called the room to order. "This hearing concerns citations issued by Officer James Mitchell to Marcus Thompson on June 15th. The judge declared, her voice crisp and commanding. "Is the citing officer present?" Mitchell stepped forward, chin high. "Yes, Your Honor." Then came the response that turned his blood to ice. "And Mr. Thompson?" A figure rose from the front row, and Mitchell's world tilted. Marcus Thompson strode forward, but he was no longer the businessman in a suit. He wore the formal uniform of a police inspector, badges of rank glittering on his chest, outshining anything Mitchell had ever dreamed of earning. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on Thompson as he approached the bench, a thick folder and a USB drive in hand. "Your Honor," Thompson began, his voice steady and resonant, the same quiet authority Mitchell remembered from that sunlit morning. "I'm Inspector Marcus Thompson, recently appointed head of internal affairs for the 47th Precinct. The citations issued to me were part of an ongoing investigation into discriminatory policing practices in our district." Mitchell's knees buckled, and Sarah's hand shot out to steady him as the truth crashed down. He hadn't stopped some random rich guy, had targeted a man tasked with rooting out the very behavior Mitchell had so carelessly displayed. Thompson's eyes met his across the courtroom, not with anger, but with a calm, piercing resolve that spoke of justice long overdue. In that moment, Mitchell saw the depth of his mistake, not just a career-ending blunder, but a lesson carved in stone. Power, when wielded without thought, could topple the one holding it. Thompson had stood firm, not out of arrogance, but from a quiet strength born of knowing the system's flaws and his role in mending them. For Mitchell, the consequences were only beginning, a reckoning that would strip away his illusions and lay bare the cost of unchecked authority. The courtroom buzzed around him, but he stood frozen, a man caught in the shadow of his own hubris. facing a truth he could no longer outrun. On a crisp morning bathed in the pale light of dawn, the air inside the courtroom grew heavy with anticipation, thick enough to press against the chests of everyone present. Officer James Mitchell, once a man who strode with unshakable confidence, now sat hunched at the defendant's table, his uniform feeling more like a shroud than a symbol of pride. The proud smirk he'd worn just hours ago as he entered the building had dissolved, replaced by a gnawing dread that churned in his gut. His career, his identity, everything he'd built over years of service seemed on the edge of collapse, and he could feel it slipping through his fingers like sand. For the first time, he saw himself not as the enforcer of order, but as a man whose own arrogance and unchecked biases had led him straight into a reckoning. Across the room, Inspector Daniel Thompson stood tall and composed, his presence radiating a quiet authority that demanded respect without effort. His dark suit was crisp, his movements deliberate as he arranged a small stack of evidence, video files, documents, and photographs on the table before him. To Thompson, this wasn't just another case, it was a mission, a chance to peel back the layers of corruption and prejudice that had festered too long in the precinct. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, flickered briefly toward Mitchell, not with malice but with a measured resolve. He'd spent months preparing for this moment, driven by a deep-seated belief that justice wasn't about destruction, it was about truth, accountability, and when possible, redemption. The judge's gavel struck the bench, a sharp crack that silenced the faint murmurs rippling through the gallery. All eyes turned to the large screen at the front of the room. As Thompson pressed play on the dashboard camera footage, the grainy image flickered to life, showing Mitchell's patrol car parked behind Thompson's unmarked sedan on a quiet stretch of road. The audio crackled through the speakers, and Mitchell's voice, brash, commanding, dripping with disdain, filled the space. "You people always think you're above the law," he'd sneered that day, his hand resting casually on the grip of his holstered weapon despite the absence of any threat. Each word landed like a stone in the courtroom, and Mitchell sank lower in his seat, his face burning with shame as he watched himself through the unforgiving lens of hindsight. The aggression in his posture, the way he loomed over Thompson's window, the extra citations he'd scribbled out with a flourish of it now looked petty, cruel, and indefensible. Thompson's voice cut through the silence, steady and professional, as he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to draw your attention to Officer Mitchell's immediate behavior upon approaching my vehicle." Notice the hand on his weapon, the absence of any provocation, and the tone he employed. He replayed the clip, pausing at key moments to let the evidence speak for itself. Mitchell stared at the screen, his stomach twisting as he saw the sneer curl his own lips, heard the venom in his own voice. It was like watching a stranger, a version of himself he hadn't wanted to acknowledge until now. In the gallery, several of his fellow officers shifted in their seats, their discomfort palpable. Some avoided his gaze, while others whispered faintly to one another, their faith in him visibly fraying. The inspector pressed on, his tone unyielding but calm. "Furthermore, I'd like to present evidence of the citations issued that day." He clicked a remote, and images of the tickets flashed onto the screen, window tinting, obstructed license plate, minor infractions stacked one atop the other. "As you can see, the window tinting citation was baseless. My vehicle's tint is well within legal limits, as certified by the manufacturer." He held up a crisp sheet of documentation, the official seal glinting under the courtroom lights. The license plate, as the video clearly shows, was fully visible and properly mounted. Each piece of evidence dismantled Mitchell's actions with surgical precision, leaving no room for excuses. Judge Elena Martinez, a woman with a reputation for fairness and a piercing gaze, studied the documents carefully, her pen scratching notes as she occasionally glanced at Mitchell. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his palms clammy against the table. In the back of the room, Captain Robert Wilson sat with his head cradled in his hands, his broad shoulders slumped under the weight of what he was witnessing. A gruff man with decades on the force, he'd always seen Mitchell as a reliable officer, hot-headed, maybe, but effective. Now, the cracks in that image were widening, and the distress etched into Wilson's weathered face spoke volumes. This wasn't just about Mitchell anymore. It was about the precinct, the culture he'd helped shape, and the failures he hadn't seen coming. The judge's voice broke the tension, firm and direct. "Officer Mitchell, would you care to explain your actions that day?" Mitchell rose on unsteady legs, his throat dry as he searched for words that refused to form. The room seemed to tilt around him, the faces of his colleagues and superiors blurring into a sea of judgment. "Your Honor," he faltered, his mind racing. How could he justify what now felt so blatantly wrong? "I was following standard procedure for traffic violations," he finally stammered, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. Thompson didn't miss a beat. "Is it standard procedure in this precinct to use phrases like 'you people' when addressing civilians? To issue unfounded citations as a form of harassment?" His questions hung in the air, sharp and heavy, cutting through Mitchell's flimsy defense. Gasps rippled through the gallery as the racial undertones of his words sank in, undeniable and ugly. Thompson stepped closer, his voice lowering, but carrying an intensity that made Mitchell flinch. "Officer, I wasn't just driving through your patrol area by chance that day. Over the past 3 months, we've received 17 complaints about discriminatory treatment during traffic stops in your sector. My presence was part of a broader investigation." The revelation hit Mitchell like a punch to the chest. His knees nearly buckled as the scope of his mistake crystallized. Only had he targeted the wrong man. But he'd walked straight into a trap he'd built with his own hands. His partner, Officer Maria Rodriguez, reached out and touched his arm, her fingers trembling slightly. She'd always been his rock, a steady presence with a quick laugh and a sharp mind. But now her dark eyes shimmered with disappointment, tinged with a quiet sadness that cut deeper than any reprimand. Thompson opened a thick folder, revealing a cascade of evidence that painted a devastating portrait of Mitchell's conduct. Printed complaints from civilians detailed encounters laced with aggression and bias. Statistical analysis showed a clear pattern. Mitchell stopped minority drivers at a far higher rate, used harsher language, and piled on multiple citations with alarming frequency. Each document was a blow, stripping away the illusions Mitchell had clung to about his own fairness. The courtroom felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing tighter with every word Thompson spoke. "Officer Mitchell," Judge Martinez said, her tone stern yet tempered with a trace of compassion. "Do you understand the gravity of what's being presented here?" His voice barely above a whisper. He replied, "Yes, Your Honor," the words heavy with the dawning realization of how far he'd strayed. The room grew taut with anticipation as the judge turned to Thompson. "Inspector, what are your recommendations in this matter?" Mitchell braced himself, his eyes squeezing shut as he prepared for the end of his career. But Thompson's response surprised everyone. "Your Honor," he began, his voice measured and thoughtful. "While Officer Mitchell's actions were clearly inappropriate and discriminatory, I believe this is an opportunity for meaningful change rather than mere punishment." Mitchell's eyes flew open, his breath catching as he stared at the inspector in disbelief. Thompson continued, "I propose a comprehensive reform program, starting with Officer Mitchell's case. But first, we must address the immediate violations presented today." As Thompson outlined his vision, Mitchell's mind reeled. This wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. It was a turning point, a chance to confront not only his own failures, but the deeper rot within the precinct. Thompson's plan was meticulous: dismiss the baseless citations, mandate sensitivity and anti-bias training, and reassign Mitchell to community outreach under his direct supervision for 6 months. During this time, Thompson said, his voice firm yet hopeful, he will work with the communities he has previously shown bias against, rebuilding trust one step at a time. Judge Martinez nodded thoughtfully, her expression unreadable as she considered the proposal. "Officer Mitchell," she said, her gaze locking onto him, "Inspector Thompson is offering you a path to redemption rather than termination. Do you understand that?" His legs trembled as he stood again, his voice raw with emotion. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." She tilted her head slightly. "Would you like to address the court?" He swallowed hard, glancing around at the faces watching him. Rodriguez with her quiet strength, Wilson with his burdened frown, Thompson with his unflinching resolve. "Your Honor," he began, his voice cracking, "I never thought of myself as prejudiced. Where I worked before, things were different. But standing here, seeing myself on that video, hearing my own words, he was wrong. Not just about Inspector Thompson, but about how I've been doing my job. I've been carrying biases I didn't even see, using my badge to intimidate instead of protect. The courtroom held its breath as he pressed on, his words unsteady but earnest. I want to accept Inspector Thompson's recommendations. I want to learn from this, to be better not just for me, but for everyone I've let down. Thompson gave a subtle nod, a flicker of approval crossing his face. Then he turned to the judge again. Your Honor, there's one more thing. This case isn't just about Officer Mitchell, it's about systemic issues in our department. His actions are symptoms of a larger problem. He produced more documents, this time detailing patterns of bias across the precinct statistics. That made Captain Wilson shift uneasily in his seat, his jaw tightening as the scope of the challenge came into focus. Judge Martinez reviewed every complaint, every statistic, every recommendation for delivering her ruling. Based on the evidence and Inspector Thompson's proposals, this court rules as follows. All citations issued during the traffic stop are hereby dismissed. Officer James Mitchell will serve a 30-day suspension without pay, during which he must complete the prescribed training program. Upon completion, he will serve 6 months of probation under Inspector Thompson's supervision and community outreach, with monthly progress reports required. She paused, her eyes resting on Mitchell. This is your chance to prove that power can be wielded with justice, not abuse. Don't waste it. As the gavel fell, Mitchell exhaled, a mix of relief and resolve washing over him. The lesson was clear. Unchecked authority could corrupt, but accountability could heal. For Thompson, it was a step toward a broader phytone that would ripple beyond this courtroom. And for the precinct, it was a mirror held up to its flaws, a call to rise above them. Justice, they all realized, wasn't just punishment, it was the hard, hopeful work of becoming better. In the courtroom, as the judge's voice rang out with a tone of finality, Officer Mitchell felt a wave of relief crash over him, washing away the dread that had been gnawing at his insides for weeks. His badge, symbol of his identity, his livelihood reigned his, at least for now. But the judge wasn't finished. With a stern gaze that seemed to pierce through the room, she declared that the precinct's traffic stop procedures and bias training programs would undergo a thorough overhaul, supervised by none other than Inspector Thompson's office. The gavel slammed down, a sharp echo bouncing off the walls, and Mitchell's chest tightened with a strange brew of emotion coiled around his ribs. Yet a fragile thread of hope flickered deep within. He'd escaped the axe, but the path ahead loomed long and daunting, a journey he hadn't anticipated when he'd walked into that room. As the crowd began to thin, Mitchell's eyes followed Inspector Thompson, who moved with quiet purpose, gathering papers and exchanging a few words with the court clerk. This man Simeon Mitchell had once dismissed with a flick of prejudice during a routine stop now, held the reins to his future. How had it come to this? How had the target of his own casual bigotry become the one offering him a lifeline? The irony stung, sharp and bitter, but beneath it, Mitchell felt the stirrings of something new, a chance, however slim, to claw his way toward redemption. Rodriguez, his fellow officer and sometime confidant, approached him as the last of the onlookers trickled out. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, carrying a weight of caution. You got lucky, Mitchell. Thompson could have buried you today. Don't let this slip through your fingers. Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. He gave a slow nod, his gaze lingering on Thompson's retreating silhouette framed by the courtroom doors. Tomorrow wasn't just another day, it was the start of a reckoning, a chance to become not only a better cop but a better man. The question gnawed at him as he left. Could he rise to the challenge, or would he falter under its weight? A week later, the first day of sensitivity training dawned, crisp and unrelenting. Mitchell found himself in a small, sterile classroom at the police academy, seated among 5 other officers whose records bore similar stains. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Resentment simmered in some. Resignation dulled the eyes of others. At precisely 8 a.m., the door swung open and Inspector Thompson stepped in, his presence commanding despite the absence of his usual crisp uniform. He wore a simple blazer and slacks, a laptop tucked under one arm and a stack of folders in the other. Behind him trailed Dr. Sarah Chen, a petite woman with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority. Her reputation as a police psychologist preceding her like a shadow. "Good morning, officers," Thompson began, his voice steady as he scanned the room, taking in each face. "You're here because your actions have hurt our community and tarnished the badge we all wear. But more than that, you're here because we believe you're capable of more." Mitchell straightened in his seat, caught off guard by the lack of venom in Thompson's tone. He'd braced himself for condemnation, maybe even a hint of vengeance, but instead, there was sincerity and earnest plea for growth that unsettled him more than any reprimand could have. Dr. Chen moved to the whiteboard, her marker squeaking as she wrote in bold letters, "Day 1, understanding our biases." She turned to face them, her expression calm but piercing. "Before we dive in, I want each of you to share the moment that landed you here. Officer Mitchell, why don't you start?" The room seemed to shrink as every pair of eyes swiveled toward him. His throat tightened, but he forced the words out, recounting the traffic stop with Thompson at the polished excuses he'd rehearsed in his head, but the raw truth of his actions, the way he'd rested his hand on his holster the moment he approached the car, the snap judgment sparked by the sight of a black man behind the wheel of a sleek, expensive sedan, the assumptions that had spilled out before he'd even opened his mouth. As he spoke, Dr. Chen scribbled notes on the board, phrases like preemptive escalation and unconscious profiling, each one a mirror held up to his choices. When he finished, she offered a nod. "Thank you for your candor. Now, let's unpack what happened." Not to point fingers, but to trace the thoughts that drove you there. For the next 3 hours, they dissected every step of that encounter, peeling back layers Mitchell had never dared examine. Why had his hand gone to his weapon so quickly? What about Thompson's car had triggered that flicker of suspicion? By the time they broke for lunch, his mind was a storm of questions, each one chipping away at the certainty he'd once clung to. He sat alone in the cafeteria, picking at a sandwich when Thompson appeared, tray in hand. "Mind if I join you?" the inspector asked, already settling into the chair across from him. Mitchell blinked, caught off guard by the casual gesture. "How's the session treating you so far?" Thompson continued, unwrapping his own lunch with deliberate care. Mitchell hesitated, then let the truth slip out. "It's uncomfortable, but I guess that's how it's supposed to be." Thompson's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "Growth doesn't come easy. When I was a rookie 30 years back, I faced officers who saw me the way you did that day. Some never budged. Others, they ended up being the ones who helped me push for change." Mitchell swallowed, the weight of the older man's words settling into him. "Sir," he ventured, his voice tentative, "why didn't you just let me sink in court? You had every reason to." Thompson set his sandwich down, his gaze locking onto Mitchell's. "Because ending your career would have been the simple way out. Justice isn't about punishment for the sake of it, it's about building something better. When I saw you watching that video of yourself, I saw a man who might actually get it. I've been on the other side of that moment, Mitchell. It's not easy, but it's worth it." The afternoon brought a shift in focuster. Chen rolled out a projector, filling the room with grainy body camera footage from real encounters. Each clip was a puzzle, and the officers were tasked with picking it apart, suggesting what could have been done differently. One video lingered in Mitchell's mind, a tense standoff that dissolved into calm, thanks to an officer's patience. He raised his hand, surprising himself with his own eagerness. "That officer did what I should have done with you, Inspector." He watched, he talked, he didn't assume. Dr. Chen's eyes lit up. "Spot on. Let's dig into the techniques he used." How he turned a spark into a conversation. As the day wound down, Mitchell felt drained, his brain buzzing with exhaustion. Yet there was a lightness to a crack in the armor he'd built around his pride. Thompson closed the session with a promise. "Tomorrow, we'll have community members join us. They're not here to tear you down, they are here to help us mend what's broken. Hear them out the way you'd want to be heard." As Mitchell packed up, a photo slipped from Thompson's folder, a younger version of the inspector, fresh-faced in his rookie uniform, beaming beside his first patrol car. It was a glimpse of vulnerability, a reminder that even Thompson had started somewhere, shaped by his own struggles. The next morning, the classroom felt different. The desks had been swapped for a circle of chairs. An intimate setup that made Mitchell's pulse quicken with anticipation and dread. He arrived early, claiming a spot where he could watch the door. One by one, the community members filed in, each carrying a story etched into their faces. There was Mrs. Jackson, a 68-year-old grandmother with silver hair and a spine of steel, her family rooted in the precinct for decades. Marcus Young, a businessman in a tailored suit, his jaw tight with memories of too many unwarranted stops. Sarah Rodriguez, not his colleague, but a high school teacher with a quiet fire in her eyes. Others followed, a tapestry of voices from the streets Mitchell had sworn to protect. Thompson opened the session with a simple truth. This isn't about blame, it's about understanding. Mrs. Jackson spoke first, her voice steady, but laced with a grief that hit Mitchell like a punch. I've raised 3 generations here. My grandson Saul college grads still call me when they drive home late, just so I know they're safe past the police. Do you know what it's like to fear the people who were supposed to keep us safe? Her eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, Mitchell felt the chasm between his reality and hers. He thought of his own sister, his nephew show he'd never had to carry that kind of worry. Marcus Young went next, his story cutting even closer to the bone. I was driving my Mercedes to a meeting 3 blocks from my office, pulled over, made to sit on the curb while my car was torn apart matched to description, they said. I missed the meeting, lost the client. The parallels to Thompson's stop were uncanny, and Mitchell's stomach churned with recognition. These weren't rants or accusations, they were pleas for dignity, for a chance to be seen as more than a threat. At lunch, he found himself beside Young, the silence between them heavy until Mitchell broke it. I'm sorry, he said, the words clumsy but real. I've been that cop, and I was wrong. Young studied him, then nodded. You're here listening. That's more than most. The afternoon turned practical, small groups of officers and residents brainstorming solutions. Mitchell threw himself into a discussion with Mrs. Jackson and to colleagues, his voice rising with an idea he hadn't known he'd had. What if we had monthly coffee meetups, cops and regular folks, just talking, no uniforms, no agendas? Thompson, watching from the sidelines, gave a quiet nod of approval. That's the spark we need, relationships before the storm hits. As the day unfolded, the divide softened. Stories flowed, some painful, some hopeful, and Mitchell scribbled notes, not out of duty, but a hunger to hold on to every lesson. Justice, he realized, wasn't just about wielding power, it was about facing the consequences when that power went astray. For every Thompson who offered a second chance, there were countless others bearing the scars of those who didn't. By the time the session ended, Mitchell felt raw, exposed, but alive with possibility. The real work was just beginning, and for once, he was ready to meet it head-on. The auditorium buzzed with the low hum of anticipation as Inspector Thompson stepped to the podium, his broad shoulders squared with purpose. He introduced the final speaker of the day, his voice steady, but laced with a quiet pride that only a father could carry. From the shadowed wings of the stage emerged a young man, his teenage slight in build, but towering in presence. The room fell silent as he took his place, his dark eyes scanning the crowd of officers before settling into a gaze both vulnerable and resolute. He began to speak, his words threading through the air like a needle pulling together to frayed edges of cloth. Growing up black in a police family, he explained, was like walking a tightrope stretched between two jagged cliffs and world, where his father's badge gleamed with honor, and another where that same badge could cast a shadow of suspicion over his own skin. My dad wears it with pride, he said, his voice catching slightly as he glanced toward Thompson, seated in the front row, but he also sat me down and taught me how to keep my hands visible. My tone calm, my movements slow just in case the officer pulling me over doesn't know I'm a cop's kid, or doesn't care. Officer Mitchell leaned forward in his seat, his eyes fixed on Thompson during the boy's speech. He saw the inspector's face shift, a flicker of joy as a father hearing his son's strength, then a tightening of the jaw, a crease of worry etched deep into his brow. It was a raw, unspoken confession. Even Thompson, a man who commanded respect in precinct corridors, couldn't shield his son from the weight of a world divided. For Mitchell, the moment landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading through his chest. This wasn't just about the mechanics of policing buttons, radios, and reports. It was about something bigger, something human, crafting a community where safety wasn't a privilege doled out to some and denied to others, where respect wasn't a gamble but a guarantee. As the day drew to a close, the room grew heavy with the scent of coffee and the rustle of notebooks. Thompson called on each officer to voice a tangible promise, a vow to reshape the way they wore their badges. When Mitchell's turn arrived, he rose to his feet, his boots scuffing the floor with a quiet resolve. His voice carried a new timbre, steady and sure. "I commit to being the kind of officer who builds trust, not fear," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. "And I want to help kick off those monthly community coffee meetings." We talked about get us all in the same room, talking, listening. Heads nodded in approval, and Thompson offered a faint smile, the kind that held both encouragement and expectation. He closed the session with words that lingered in the air like a challenge. "Change isn't instant. It's a slow burn, fueled by every choice you make. Today, you've lit the first spark." The sun dipped low as Mitchell crossed the parking lot, his keys jangling in his hand. A voice cut through the evening chill, sharp, familiar, warm. "Officer Mitchell." He turned to see Mrs. Jackson striding toward him, her coat pulled tight against the breeze, her silver hair catching the last light of day. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes bright with determination. "I'll be at that first coffee meeting," she declared, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "And I'm bringing my grandsons. They need to see that things can shift, that hope's not just a word." Mitchell stood there, struck by the weight of her trust, her faith in something he was only beginning to grasp. He drove home that night under a sky streaked with purple and gold, the weight of his badge feeling different, lighter somehow, yet heavier with purpose. It hit him then, clear as the headlights cutting through the dusk. Policing wasn't about flexing power or barking orders. It was about shielding people, serving them, all of them, no matter their face or their story. The weeks of sensitivity training blurred past, each day a mosaic of revelations and reckonings. Mitchell wrestled with his old instincts, unpicking the threads of bias he hadn't even known were stitched into him. Then came the final hurdle, a one-on-one with Thompson. The inspector's office was a sanctuary of warmth, its walls adorned with polished community service awards and faded family photos. A little girl in pigtails, a teenage boy in a basketball jersey. Moments of a life lived beyond the precinct. Thompson waved Mitchell to a chair, his fingers flipping through a thick file on the desk. "Officer Mitchell," he began, his voice low and deliberate, "I've kept a close eye on you. Your instructors say you've turned a corner. Your reactions in scenarios, your attitude, it's all shifted. But the real proof comes now, out there on the streets." Mitchell straightened, his pulse quickening. "I get it, sir. I've been thinking hard about going back to patrol, how I'll do things differently." Thompson set the folder aside, leaning forward, his full attention a spotlight. "Tell me about these community coffee plans." Mitchell's face lit up, words tumbling out with an eager edge. "We've locked down the community center first Saturday of every month. Mrs. Jackson's been spreading the word like wildfire, and 15 officers have already signed up. We're calling it Coffee with Cops, building bridges." Thompson's nod was slow, approving, but his eyes sharpened. "Good. Just don't forget it's not about the coffee or the small talk. It's about mending trust that's been cracked for decades." Mitchell reached into his pocket, pulling out a battered notebook scribbled with ideas. "I've been working with Marcus Young, who runs the hardware store downtown. We're starting a business owners advisory council. They'll tell us how our patrols hit their bottom line, where we're helping or hurting." A knock rattled the door, and Officer Rodriguez stepped in, a stack of papers cradled in her arms. She flashed Mitchell a grin, familiar, teasing, the kind only a former partner could muster. "Ready to get back out there, huh?" she said, but Thompson raised a hand, cutting through the moment. "Hold on, there's a shift in plans." He turned to Mitchell, his expression unreadable. "For the next 6 months, you're with the Community Outreach Unit. Rodriguez here will be your senior partner. She's been at this longer, and she's damn good at it." Mitchell blinked, surprise mingling with relief. Rodriguez had a knack for reading people, for diffusing tension with a word or a look, skills he knew he needed to soak up. "Your first gig starts tomorrow," Thompson added. You'll talk to the new recruits at the academy. Tell them your story. Why unbiased policing matters. Mitchell's stomach lurched. Sir, you want me to? Yes. Thompson cut in, firm but not harsh. Your story's got teeth because you've lived both sides of it. They need to hear it. The next morning, Mitchell stood before a sea of 30 recruits, their crisp uniforms and wide eyes mirroring his own from years back. The academy lecture hall smelled of fresh paint and ambition, but his palms were slick with nerves. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the quiet. 6 weeks ago, he started, his voice shaky at first. I was the kind of officer who saw threats where there were only people. I let snap judgment steer me, used my badge like a wall to hide behind. He paused, locking eyes with a recruit in the front row, a young woman with a notepad poised, stared back with unguarded curiosity. Then he let it all spill out, the traffic stop that unraveled him, the courtroom's cold glare, the suspension that forced him to face himself. For an hour, he bared every misstep and every lesson, his words raw and unpolished. The recruits leaned in, some scribbling furiously, others just watching, rapt. When the Q&A began, a hand shot up a slight, weary kid with a buzz cut. Sir, how do we keep from slipping into those same ruts? Mitchell took a breath, the question sinking deep. See every person you meet as someone's brother, someone's mom, he said. They're not just a stop or a satire human, same as you. Treat them that way, and you'll stay grounded. At the back of the room, Thompson had slipped in unnoticed, his arms crossed, his face a mask of quiet appraisal. When it was over, he approached, hand outstretched. Well done, Mitchell. You've come miles. Mitchell gripped his hand, the gratitude swelling in his throat. Thank you, sir, for all of it. Thompson chuckled, a rare softness breaking through. Don't thank me yet. Tomorrow, you're with Rodriguez full day of community meet and greets. She's got a list a mile long. Mitchell left the academy that afternoon, the weight of the past 6 weeks settling into something new, a purpose that hummed in his bones. His phone pinged as he reached his car. Rodriguez. Ready for tomorrow, partner. First stop's Mrs. Jackson's neighborhood watch. He grinned. Typing back. Ready. Let's make it count. The real work loomed ahead, but for the first time, he felt equipped not just to enforce, but to connect, to protect every corner of his community with the fairness it deserved. 6 months later, the 47th precinct was unrecognizable in its brick and mortar, but in its heartbeat. The community coffee meetings had ballooned from a scattering of chairs to a throng of over 100 regulars, forcing a move to a cavernous hall downtown. On this morning, Mitchell stood at a podium in the precinct's main conference room, his probation report a stack of papers trembling slightly in his hands. The Thompson at its helm watched him with steady eyes, while Mrs. Jackson beamed from the front row, her grandsons fidgeting beside her. When I started this, Mitchell began, his voice carrying a quiet strength. I thought it was about paying a price. I was wrong. It was about rebuilding not just me, but all of us. He clicked through slide charts, showing complaints plummeting, response times tightening, crimes cracking open with community tips. The Business Owners Council, now 30 strong, had reshaped patrols into a dance of safety and support. But it's not the numbers that matter, he said, his tone softening. It's the moments. He told them about officers tossing footballs at block parties, not as guards, but as neighbors. About Mrs. Jackson's grandsons, once skittish round uniforms, now begging to join the junior academy. She rose then, her voice cutting through the room like a bell. 6 months back, my boys flinched at a siren. Last week, they asked me about badges. That's what you've done here, Marcus Young followed, his deep baritone recounting how traffic stops had shed their edificers, now greeting drivers, explaining the why before the what. It's simple, he said, but it changes everything. Thompson scribbled notes, his pen scratching faintly against the hush when the last speaker sat. He stood, his presence filling the space. Mitchell's story could have ended with a pink slip. Instead, it sparked something bigger. He stepped to the podium, his gaze sweeping the room. Based on this and the data, the voices, the trust you've built amending your probation, and more, you're heading our expanded community relations unit. The room erupted. Applause crashing like waves. Mitchell froze, emotion clawing up his throat as Rodriguez clapped him on the shoulder. Her grin wide. A line formed: cops, residents, kids, each handshake a tether to the world he'd helped reshape. That evening, he parked in the same spot where it all began. Night he'd pulled over Thompson's son, blind to the lesson waiting in the dark. Now, the streets hummed with life. Waves replaced wary glances. Smiles outshone suspicion. His radio cracklet a rookie on a stop, handling it with the new playbook. Mitchell watched, pride swelling as the kid kept it calm, respectful, fair. A text buzzed in. Thompson, remember the start. Swing by the community center. Puzzled, he drove over, finding the lot packed, the air thick with laughter and grilling meat. Inside, officers and locals mingled. Kids darted between games. Adults swapped stories. Mrs. Jackson handed him a coffee, her eyes twinkling. First evening gathering. Mornings weren't enough. Mitchell took it all in: the chatter, the trust, the bridges he'd helped build. He thought of the officer he'd been, quick to judge, slow to see, and felt a quiet awe at how far he'd come. Joining a knot of teens asking about cop life, he realized this wasn't just his redemption. It was a blueprint of proof that justice, wielded right, could heal what power, abused, had broken. The precinct wasn't flawless, but it was better forged, one cup, one talk, one changed heart at a time.